Good evening, and welcome to the Young Center for Anabaptist and Pietist Studies here at Elizabethtown College. Welcome to all of you who are here at the Rufus Booker Meeting House and all those who are joining us online across the country. With support from Elizabethtown College, the Young Center fosters and promotes the study of communities rooted in and emerging from Anabaptist and Pietist experiences and identities in all of their cultural complexities. And that complexity has included creativity and artistic endeavors, although one wouldn't always know that from reading the histories of these communities, not always a part of community life that was recognized or acknowledged by the groups from which such creative expression grew. But this evening, we will be learning about one Mennonite poet, Jane Turner Rohr, and I'll not say more about her since that's the focus of the talk this evening, but instead introduce our speaker, Dr. Julia Spicher Kasdorf, professor of English at Penn State University and a regarded poet herself. Kasdorf co-curated a Palmer Museum of Art, that is the Museum of Art on the Penn State campus, the Palmer Museum of Art exhibition of the poetry of Jane Rohr and the paintings of Warren Rohrer, and co-edited the companion catalog, Field Language, the paintings and poetry of Warren and Jane Rohr. Copies of that catalog are available for sale in the lobby, as are one of the chapbooks of Jane's poetry. Julia has also published 4 books of poetry of her own, including most recently a book of text and photos, Shale Play, Poems and Photographs from the Fracking Fields, in collaboration with Steven Rubin, telling the stories of people who live in the fracking fields of Pennsylvania. I had the opportunity to see the Palmer Museum exhibit last May, and I'm looking forward to seeing a different but similar exhibition of paintings and poetry at the Woodmere Museum, which will be opening in a couple months in April 9, I believe. I want to let our live stream audience know that they can submit questions via the Q&A feature, not the chat feature, but the Q&A feature. And as time permits, we'll take up those questions or as many as we can. And now I have come as my name, the Vocation and Poetry of Jane Rohr.
Thank you, Steve. I want to thank the Young Center and Cynthia Nault also for helping to organize this evening. Thank you all for coming out on an evening that has been, there's a lot of strange news today between Ukraine and the weather. So I appreciate your coming out to hear a lecture about poetry and art. I will say, first of all, that I also want to thank my life partner, Philip Ruth, who is not only a historian and a writer, he's an excellent proofreader, which I always need, and expert at PowerPoint. So my talk this evening draws attention to a neglected American writer of Mennonite origins. Continuing work started by a recent fellow of the Young Center, Anne Hostetler. Almost 2 decades ago, Anne gathered poems for an anthology published in 2003 by the University of Iowa Press. A cappella, Mennonite Voices in Poetry. Like any anthology, Anne's made an implicit argument that she later stated explicitly in an article that appeared in the Mennonite Quarterly Review. Publication of poetry by Mennonites in the American mainstream press started with women, Ruth Ediger Bear, Jane Jansen, and Jane Rohr. Before a public reading to launch a cappella that Anne had arranged on the campus at the University of Pennsylvania in November 2004, Jane Rohr hosted Canadian Mennonite poet Di Brandt, seated there on your right, Hostetler and myself in her home. Here Anne appears at the right. I sit beside Jane, and over her shoulder hangs one of her husband Warren's paintings, Yellow, Yellow. I recall Warren once saying in the early 1990s that yellow was the only color he could see in nature in every season. In this photograph, I see a tangible illustration of the intimate relationship between Jane's life and Warren's painting. Her literary sensibility grew along with his artistic sensibility as she learned to look at art and the world by his side. But the painting, you see, hangs over her head. This is the entire painting. It's dated 1992 to 93. It's about 48 inches square. And I will say that these paintings are very subtle, and it's really difficult to capture them with photography and certainly projected images like this. Born in 1928 and 1927, respectively, Jane and Warren Rohrer belong to the first generation of Mennonites in the United States who turned from rural life to artistic exploration and work. With Jane's support, Warren was arguably the only Mennonite to achieve a significant place in the visual art world during the 20th century in the United States. His paintings housed in collections such as the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. The Philadelphia Art Museum celebrated his career with a major retrospective in 2003, and he continues to be represented by Locks, a leading gallery in that city. Last year, as Steve said, the Palmer Museum of Art at Penn State, where Warren pursued graduate work and eventually taught in a summer painting program, mounted a major exhibition of his paintings and Jane's poetry in relation to objects from the traditional material culture here in Lancaster County: quilts, ceramics, and painted wood surfaces that sometimes inspired Warren's painting. You can see images of that, videos, and other information on a website that's just, if you Google field language Penn State, you'll come to this website that's really a digital companion for the exhibition, because the exhibition was really shortened and few people got to see it because of the pandemic. A related but different exhibition focused more explicitly on the relationship between painting and poetry will take place this spring from April 9 to July 10 at Woodmere in Chestnut Hill, just north of Philadelphia. And I want to encourage you all to drive over to Chestnut Hill and see these paintings in real life. I also want to note that my research for these exhibitions and this evening's presentation began with a project I prepared for the 8th Mennonites Writing Conference that was held in Winnipeg, Manitoba in 2017, and subsequently published as an article in the Journal of Mennonite Studies. My goal has been to expand the attention rightfully paid to Warren's work, to also include the poetry of his life partner. Like many women of her generation, Jane's career was deferred. But I believe it was never a matter of her finding a voice late in life. Jane always had a voice. She just didn't always have the time or nurture or audience for it to flourish. And I believe that we are honored this evening to have Jane out there in the Zoom sphere, and we might hear from her at the Q&A. Martha Jane Turner, standing here in front of her mother, was the second of 6 children and the first daughter born on a family farm near Broadway in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. The Turners belonged to Zion Mennonite Church, part of the Virginia Mennonite Conference during a conservative era. Her father descended from what she has called hillbilly ancestors who herded cattle in the mountains on the border of Virginia and West Virginia. Grandfather Turner became a Mennonite and eventually a church deacon. But Martha Jane's father, C.C. Turner, a prosperous breeder of Tennessee walking horses, was often at odds with church leaders. Her more devout mother, from Church of the Brethren background, was left to negotiate the difference, and Martha Jane often bore the burden of her mother's stress and domestic labor. Nevertheless, even at 10, she wrote news of her life in a letter that was published in Words of Cheer. These are Jane's sentences. For pets, I have 1 cat and 4 kittens. My name has been handed down for 5 generations. We raised 14,000 turkeys this summer. Aunt Lena Zook Ressler replied in print by asking whether Thanksgiving had not cleared out those turkeys. And with regard to her family name, whether Martha Jane knew about another Martha who was much cumbered about serving, Luke 10. Of course, you'll note that Jane dropped Martha somewhere along the line, which seems like a good spot to interrupt the biography and read one of the first poems that Jane published in the American Poetry Review in 1977. In an interview several years ago, she told me that in the early 1970s, as her sons left home, she began to study and write poems with intent, although she had written some poetry all along, in love letters to Warren, for instance. She took a class with an Irish poet at Temple University and audited a course at the College of the Arts with Stephen Berg, a colleague of her husband. One day in class, when no other students would share their work, Jane timidly read her poem aloud. In a dramatic gesture of discovery, Berg plucked that poem, Mennonite Funeral in the Shenandoah Valley, for publication in the American Poetry Review, which he edited. And it's one of the leading poetry journals in the country. He continued to publish Jane's work regularly thereafter, including an 11-poem supplement in 2013. With vivid imagery, this poem renders the strained assembly of family gathered for the speaker's mother's funeral. It includes direct quotations from several different voices. Listen for the genteel refrain, "So nice of you to come," and for the preacher's stern admonition of those who have left the faith. Notice the phrase of a hymn, biblical allusions to the eye of the needle and the hem of the garment. The entire episode framed by a familiar verse from the book of Proverbs, train up a child. Mennonite Funeral in the Shenandoah Valley. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Proverbs 22:6. I could never reach this place but for a memory of Christmas that plays at the edge of the winter in my mind. Beside me in the long hallway, my father chokes softly. He is down now from the black horse and back from the worldly track he rode in widening circles away from her. In the front parlor, she has drawn her circle around her. Still and unreachable, she receives the favored. So nice of you to come. Outside on the curved driveway, we must all fit somehow on this natural occasion. My aunts, her secular sisters, sit in black cars, smoothing on their gloves, finger by inspected finger. In the way of things, I wait with him in some other black car until the column uncouples, awake behind her bell coach, inching ahead. Soundless, we creep, we crawl to the last place and couple obedient in line under the old pines that sigh as in memory. Some of her people wait. So nice of you to come. I watch her gain the plain doorway, that eye of the needle, and move regally up the gray aisle under pink roses without her crutch. We wait in a room strangled of air and listen to the clock choke. Mustiness lingers in odor of pamphlet and Sunday vest. The light, unstained, lies in blocks on the cold floor. We, the uneven hem of her earthly garment, are pleated to fit the short front pew. Breathe, breath. I cannot breathe this death. I hear the varnished pulpit say, dearly beloved, and you who have left the faith, and this saint. Her pink fragrance is paling now, and this is bitter bread. Oh, day in my sweet life, going home, going home. I take my place with the unforgiven, see her folded into that satin cathedral. Oh, strange return. Oh, train up a child. Oh, child. I find the ending of this poem very moving. As the speaker watches her mother being folded up into the satin cathedral of the coffin. One possible implication of that image, the church is a place for the dead. And the speaker marks herself among the unforgiven in a world that can see people only in one of two ways, inside and outside. The final lines haunt as the grieving speaker is left only with herself for comfort. Oh, strange return. Oh, train up a child. Oh, child. Returning to biography, Martha Jane attended Eastern Mennonite High School and then Eastern Mennonite College during the 1940s, years of strict control of students' dress and bodies. She's depicted here in her role as assistant editor of the Weather Vane, a student newspaper which at that time had a mascot of that stuffed owl. She met Warren during the summer of 1946, and in her words, fell so hard, she was nuts about that man for 48 years. When the couple married in November 1948, Jane was 20, Warren would soon turn 21. They moved to Warren's home community in Smoketown here in Lancaster County, and during the less than a year they lived here, Jane helped to launch a bi-weekly newsletter at Mellinger Mennonite Church. And I want to thank Steve, who's written a history of that congregation, for alerting me to Jane's part in the publication. Before the Rohrers returned to Harrisonburg, the editor revealed that Jane had written an editorial poem that ran without a byline on the newsletter's front page. Essentially, a condemnation of narrow-minded, judgmental Christians lineated as poetry, the piece embodied a searching and strongly moral voice. And I'm not going to read it here, but it is in the book out there if you're interested in checking that out. On returning to Harrisonburg, the couple moved into a tiny house near campus purchased by Jane's father. Jane dropped out after 2 years of coursework to take a clerical job in the dean's office, while Warren completed a BA in Bible from EMC, and 1 year later, a BS in art education at nearby James Madison. By then, according to Jane, the couple had snuck off to the cinema in Harrisonburg, visited the National Gallery in Washington, and in her favorite phrase, determined to gang up and run away. In 1952 and 53, Jane gave birth to 2 sons, John and Dean, and during the 1950s, the family lived in suburban Philadelphia. Warren, a high school art teacher, gradually gained more education, gallery representation, and eventually obtained a faculty position at Philadelphia College of Art, now the University of the Arts. During the summer of 1961, the Rohrers purchased an old farmhouse with a barn and 12 acres near Christiana, Pennsylvania. Warren rented the fields to Amish neighbors and converted the barn into a painting studio. This farm, now owned by Kate and Harley Cooker, would be the Rohrers' home for 23 years. Jane worked like a dog, by her own account, during those years, gardening and homemaking. The paradox of their move, she stated in one brilliant sentence: "There was no looking back, and all he did was look back." By the early 1970s, Jane had joined a serious poetry group in Lancaster, Countermeasure. This is a newspaper article announcing one of their readings. And Jane's friend, Russell Culver, who's the woman, Jane is the woman on the left and Russell is the woman on the right. I think Russell might be in the audience tonight too. So this was a pretty serious group. There were a couple of professors involved in it. And Jane told me about this time: "I was writing by the seat of my pants, personal narrative poems. That's all I knew to write." Of course, that was true of many women publishing in the 1970s, when Adrienne Rich and others recognized the cultural necessity and political power of life writing by women. A number of Jane's poems from this time give us intimate glimpses into the life world that was also the context for Warren's abstract paintings. Some of the poems are spoken in a fresh voice as it discovers meaning through the imaginative consideration of particular tasks and places on the farmstead: the upper field, the pond, the lower field, the orchard. These all show up in the poems. In Making Hay, for instance, we see the speaker literally holding up a large canvas while he, the painter, photographs it on a day that is opportune for picture taking and baling hay. The alignment of these labors, painter, farmer, prompts a revelation. Things come into focus in the speaker's mind's eye as she realizes that the neighbor's baler works windrows in the lockstep rhythm of an old poem. Farmer, painter, and poet fall together in the analogous and painstaking work of making lines and making rows. This metaphor alludes to the etymology of the word verse, verso, from the Latin for turn, the turn of the plow, the turn of the line. And it also points to a more esoteric term, boustrophodon, a very, very early kind of writing in which the text read from the left to the right and the right to the left, and there's an example here on the screen. I first learned that word from Warren, and it appears in Jane's work. We'll hear it in a later poem. The title, Making Hay, brings to mind the idiom, make hay while the sun shines. A country person's carpe diem, seize the moment for the purpose of pleasure or work, for soon the sun will set. Making hay. Things come into focus during the afternoon as I stand behind the large painting, holding the brace steady against a playful wind. I hear the camera click as he photographs the whole picture, then walks up close and details converging rows of color. We are on a broad, flat place near the barn in light haze, ideal for photographing and for making hay. I see John enter the alfalfa field with a 6-mule team pulling a gasoline engine and a bulky baler to begin working the windrows. The whole contrivance crossing the field in the lockstep rhythm of an old poem. The first bale hangs at the top of the chute. John's son pulls it down and stacks it at the back of the wagon. The little girl tugs at it also. Her dress is the purple of the painting's edge where the gray-green dissolves. I am thinking of cows in winter, chewing, and of the idea of cud. In a sudden turn, at the end of the poem, the poet becomes a ruminant herself. That voice I recognize as distinctly Jane's, witty, surprising, slightly removed. She may be holding his paintings, but her thoughts are her own. A similar point of view speaks in the poem titled Auction, where an outsider traces some moral dilemmas of this very old Mennonite settlement here in Lancaster County. As poet and person, Jane consistently refused false feeling. She has observed that Warren and his high school and college classmate and friend, Mennonite author and historian John Ruth, have entertained a romantic idea about the country that she does not necessarily share. In the poem Auction, the speaker accompanies a nostalgic partner to a farm sale on his family's land. He is comfortably clothed in a long, warm genealogy. Unprotected by tribal lineage, she is chilly, yet her outsider position affords a clearer vision of the situation. Why have we come here, she wonders, knowing the heirlooms are long gone, the fields subdivided and sold. She finds no charm in country uncles wearing great uncle suits who bid a few dollars for old shovels. Notice how melancholic attachment to tradition and genealogy alienates an outsider and perhaps becomes idolatry. Auction. The day is dizzy. I am gloomy here with you at this gathering of your side of the family. I watch you appreciate the occasion and you are smiling, watching a movie I haven't seen. You see benevolently, are comfortably clothed in a long, warm genealogy, but I am chilly here and tell you this. Please talk to me about these old men, your uncles in great uncle suits, whose wives are inflated under coats and have tightly fettered hair. Why do they tabulate the price of every leaky bucket and grieve to part with shovels? Listen to them bid, calling dollars, holding up a number against the wind. Why have we come here? The heirlooms are gone, long dispersed, and the acres divided, plowed under and planted, and have sprouted into these wart-like houses on the land. Yet, this draws you as to an origin. I wonder if we dig straight down under Uncle Jason there, will we come to it? Look, I'm not buying any of this. These final piles of things, their truth is the truth of funerals. That's what I love about Jane Rohrer. The blunt and incisive voice and vision. She is not buying any of this. She will neither purchase nor accept what's worthless or offensive to her soul. These little final piles of things, their truth is the truth of funerals. In 1978, Warren was diagnosed with leukemia. The couple sold the Christiana farm in 1981 and 3 years later moved to a remarkable place on the edge of Fairmount Park in the Mount Airy section of Philadelphia. Jane worked with an architect, literally was employed by the firm at one point during the renovation of the barn that had once served as the studio and residence for Violet Oakley, painter of the colossal murals for the State Capitol building in Harrisburg. Although they lived in the city between 1987 and 1993, Warren documented an adopted field near Churchtown in Carnarvon Township in northeastern Lancaster County. It's not too far from Morgantown, with sketches and photographs that inspired the final abstract paintings that would secure his reputation. He sketched and painted from images of the same field over time. Corn stubble became language-like marks that sometimes look like scars on the canvas. Warren passed in 1995. Jane's poem, Fields in Snow, is the only one she explicitly wrote about one of Warren's paintings. This painting, which he painted for her. In the poem, she imagines the deceased painter return to the field in the countryside. The line between life and art have become indistinguishable between writing, painting, corn stubble, between a thin wash of pigment or the scrim of snow, between this world and the next. Painter and poet remain connected yet temporarily separate for the time being, located in the parallel planes delineated in the work. Fields in Snow. You have obviously been here since my last visit, and I like what you've done, but is it landscape or is it art? It's all so confusing with you coming from the other side. Calligraphy, there on the contours of the field, scribbling in stalks and stacks left from the fall, is visible in the distant upper levels of the canvas, if it is a canvas. But it's the wash of thin white, just a sift of snow, or is it white that erases the visual samsara and beckons me to you beyond the pale. We've been split like a schist. Here I am. There you are, parallel. The speaker in this poem calls the canvas or snowy field samsara, Sanskrit term for wandering or flowing on, which refers to the cycle of life, death, rebirth. But a person cannot live on this earth and remain in that intermediate space forever. In Jane's poem, Widow, the speaker describes in unpunctuated lines the way grief shrinks a person's world. So it feels as if she just paces around inside a snow globe, walking back and forth like the ox plowing. Boustrophidan. Widow. She lived years in grief's exquisite sphere, walking as the oxen walks, Boustrophidan, in a small field, tended a garden so miniature, you could put it in a safe at night, and took short afternoon strolls on the lawns of her memories. Why, you could hold her and her whole world in one hand and shake it like a snow-filled paperweight. Her mouth opens in a large O. Her eyes register a slowed taking in of the world as she runs out of air in the low, wintry light of her permeable shell. But I have come as my name from that safe jail, have clawed through the membrane that was so bright with only my skin against this spacious room in the cold. I am as you, at risk of breathing, skittery, wind-borne, free. I have come as my name, the poem claims, and I take that name not to be Martha or Jane, but Roar. Roar. Her voice breaks free, clawing through grief's membrane, skittery, but wind-borne. Freedom in those years came with travel, as Jane was invited to accompany her brother Charles on a number of international trips. Also during this time, Stephen Berg, Jane's early mentor, asked for copies of her poems, which he passed along to a well-positioned poet and editor of the esteemed Sheep Meadow Press, Stanley Moss. The next day, Moss telephoned Jane to say he wanted to publish a book. He selected, edited, and ordered a volume of 60 poems and invited Jane to his office above the Hudson River, where they spent a morning reviewing his edits. On the cover of the typescript, Jane noticed that he had scrawled, extraordinary, extraordinary, extraordinary. No doubt Moss heard in Jane's work an authentic colloquial voice that combines intimate observation of everyday life with keen insight. In 2002, at the age of 74, Jane published her first book, Life After Death. The first edition is out of print, but I am pleased to announce publicly for the first time this minute that it will be reissued this spring with this newly designed cover in conjunction with the Woodmere exhibition and it will be published by Ann Hostetler and her new enterprise, Painted Glass Press. And those of you from Lancaster County know what painted glass is, right? Yeah. Warren's mom painted on glass. This book accompanies a slimmer volume of late poems published by Cascadia Press in 2020, available here this evening. And in conclusion, I want to share one more wonderful poem from this second book, in which the speaker reflects on a visit to that old sinking city, Venice, in Italy, and directly addresses the reader, us, offering travel advice that also expresses wisdom about life's losses. Leaving Venice. I am the one on the back deck of the ship, leaving the canal, the one crying at the opera aria and near to going overboard in the music of the wake churning up. Of what I saw and what I heard, I can say little, or reach back for what I mourn to take it with me. If I had stayed, and we never can, I would have met them all. There would have been teacups and goblets, and as in the old days, and eventually I would have danced in a long swag of skirt, and Venice would have been as it is in the books written by English women. Attachment would have fastened me to those stone steps I bought and would lose. How contradictory of me. I was hardly there, certainly not long enough to leave. Take my advice. If you go for more than a minute, you will die for its decaying perfection when you leave. You will play the films over and over and do things intensely as though for the last time. You will come to sound like a lonely cello. But then, I am not talking about Venice. Although Jane suffered a major stroke in June 2015, she still resides in the barn studio residence. With the help of her children, she continues to work every day at coming back. That is, regaining strength and acuity on the left side of her body. When I asked her what coming back might mean to her, Jane replied with characteristic candor, "Coming back is the opposite of going away." And reflecting on the function of writing in her life, she once described poetry as a kind of pragmatic and personal homemaking. Both acceptance of circumstance and the creation of a shelter for the self. Writing a poem is like building a paper house out of the life you have, she said. You make a place for yourself to live. Thank you for listening.
And as there are questions, raise your hand. I'll let you field the questions, and please repeat the questions so that those listening at home are able to hear.
Okay. It's okay to be quiet. Yes.
Any observations on why Jane did not do more writing about Warren?
Oh, she did write about Warren. So the question was, do I have any observations about why Jane did not do more writing about Warren? She did write about Warren. And there's some wonderful, vivid, sexy, personal, wonderful poems, especially in that first book, which is going to be reissued. It wasn't the focus of my talk, and also too, I think, actually the way that first book was ordered by the editor, and it begins with, I wish I had it with me, but I don't. It begins with a love, actually, could you get the catalog out there that's open? I'm going to read you just one of a short poem. It begins with short love poems and it ends with a love poem. So the entire book feels like it's framed as really as a love poem to Warren. But I think the back of this has a bunch of poems and paintings paired. And I think now it's not gonna be in here. See, it's scrambled in my mind because we also have paintings and poems paired for the exhibition at Woodmere, but this is one. So this is near the end or the final poem in that collection, that first collection. It's called Valentine. I will make you a valentine of snow. You can let it melt and dip your fingers in to know how a rivulet felt. Or lift it to your lips to slake a thirst. If you remember sips and thirst and lips. Where you have gone or go, I will send you a valentine of snow in case you do not touch snow now. So that's like a Valentine sent to the afterlife.
Question that came in from the online audience. Did any of Jane's other siblings pursue higher education or creative work?
Ooh. Okay, the question from the online audience, and I'm not sure I can answer it, but there might be someone here who can. The question was, did any of Jane's other siblings pursue higher education? I don't know the answer to that. Stuart?
I think at least one, that June Rohrer, who married a Rohrer, also James Rohrer.
Okay, so June Rohrer, Jane's sister.
And then there's another question. What has been Jane's response to the recent exhibits?
Jane, okay, what has Jane's response been to the recent exhibits? She and her son John and his wife Prilla, they all live together there in the barn. I mean, it's not a barn now. It was built as a barn a long time ago. But it's a beautiful place. But they have all been incredibly helpful and supportive in helping us think about the work, talk about where paintings are, how to get them for the exhibitions. We also included in State College a quilt. Warren and Jane collected old quilts back in the 70s here in Lancaster County. And so they've just been incredibly helpful. And I think Jane always seems shocked that we're interested, as we are. Dad?
Did Jane have support among the Mennonite women?
The question is, did Jane have support among the Mennonite women? Well, she lived in different communities, right? So Harrisonburg and Bridgewater, Broadway, and then here in Lancaster. I think that it's hard to interpret someone's life, so I'm pausing, but my impression is that in the early 1960s, the Mennonite women in Lancaster County would not have known what to do with Jane. Yes.
You talked about them as being the first generation of Mennonites who made mainstream arts. And then what has that legacy been?
Okay.
Going forward?
Thank you. Yeah, so the question is, I spoke of them as the first generation of American Mennonites. In the Netherlands, there's a very different story from long ago, but who entered the mainstream? And then the question is, what has happened since then? I would say since then, since the early 90s, there has been a remarkable explosion of literary production among Mennonites in North America, Canada, and US. I think the visual arts, it's harder. It's harder because of the whole way the art world works. And, visual artists are producing one-of-a-kind objects, usually, at least if they're traditional painters like Warren, and then to get gallery representation. And it's just a much less democratic medium from what I can tell. And so I think it's been slower, but there are certainly many more people involved in the arts.
What has been Jane's influence in your own life and work? And do you see her as part of your hope in establishing her name more widely, that she will have been recognized as a presenter?
Okay, this question is, what is Jane's influence in my life? And is part of my work hoping that she'll be recognized as a progenitor or a pioneer of some sort? I think she was a pioneer without realizing it. And in the article that Anne Hostetler wrote that came out of that work in assembling that anthology, she noted that, so my first book was published in 1992, and I didn't know Jane's work. I might have seen it in the American Poetry Review, but I would not have recognized it. I don't think, there wasn't, I was seeking models and there weren't many at that time. And then I was fortunate to get to know Jane and Warren in 92, 93. But I think it's only doing this work and interviewing her from about 2017 on that she has influenced me. How can I say this? She has influenced me as I am about to turn 60 and enter a different chapter of my life. She is giving me ways of thinking about voice and gender. I think when I was younger, it was easier for me to look for models outside my community. So I haven't thought through a response to your question, Shirley, but I think I want to lean into this kind of voice that I hear in her work, which I haven't always had.
Where is Warren's work, or is Warren's work on permanent exhibit anywhere, or where is it housed?
Where is Warren's work housed? I will tell you that there are individual paintings in major museums. The best place to see a bunch of the work is the Locks Gallery, LOCKS. They are going to have an exhibition this spring in conjunction with the Woodmere exhibition. So Locks is in downtown Philly. And like there's one painting that's on permanent exhibit at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. But if you want to see a whole gallery full of his paintings, the Locks Gallery, and if you just go to their website, you can see when exactly that exhibition it'll be up for about a month during the time that the exhibition will be up at Woodmere Museum for 3 months. 3. Yeah, 3. Yeah.
Another question. Did Jane experience support from her extended biological family for her poetry writing?
You know, the question is, did Jane experience support for her writing from her extended biological family? I think her support came from other poets mostly and friends. Well, I will be happy to talk with folks individually, and I just thank you for being here this evening, and I hope the ice hasn't come yet when you get outside. Thanks a lot.
There was also one other comment, not a question, that came in from the virtual audience that said your explanation about the later development of the Mennonite art and literature world was too modest because the growth in Mennonite literary works is in no small part due to your examples and books of poetry. So someone wanted me to be sure and mention that since you didn't mention that yourself. We need to wrap up our time this evening, but I want to thank Julia for sharing with us this evening, and thanks to all of you for being here. Looking ahead to next month, on Thursday, March 24th, Joe Springer, curator of the Mennonite Historical Library at Goshen College in Goshen, Indiana, will be our Dernball lecturer speaking on Anabaptist hymnody, with a special focus on the 16th century hymnal, the Ausbund. This event the Dernball lecture will not be held in this space, but will be across campus in the Susquehanna room, and that's because there will be a dinner preceding the lecture. If you want to come to the dinner, we do need you to pre-register for that online via our website by March 10th. You can also just come to the lecture at 7 o'clock. In the Susquehanna room. Again, that's Thursday, March 24th. And then the next morning, Friday, March 25th at 10 a.m., Joe Springer will present the Dernball Seminar, which will be a further exploration of Anabaptist hymnody, what we know about 16th century hymnody and what avenues of research merit further attention. And that event will be here in the Young Center. Special thanks this evening to our support staff from Information Technology Services here at Elizabethtown College, who made this program possible, and thanks to Elizabethtown College for its support of the Young Center. Thank you all for coming. Have a good evening.